Spring sunlight cut through the dust on Harlan Voss's windshield as he slowed his Ford pickup along County Road 142 3 miles south of Lamar, Missouri. The year was 1970. America had put men on the moon 9 months earlier. The interstate highway system snaked across the continent. Computers filled entire rooms at universities. And there in a field of black Missouri soil, a man was plowing with mules. Harlan pulled to the shoulder and killed the engine. Through the open window came the sound he hadn't heard in a working field since his childhood. The jingle of trace chains, the creak of leather, the low command of a human voice directing animals instead of machinery. The man behind the plow wore faded denim and a straw hat that had seen too many summers. The mules, a matched pair, dark brown with white muzzles, leaned into their collars with the steady rhythm of creatures born to pull. Harlan reached for the Polaroid camera on his passenger seat. He'd bought it to photograph tractors at his dealership to show farmers the gleaming new John Deere models they could own for just a signature on a loan agreement. The camera whirred and ejected a square of chemical-soaked paper. Harlan watched the image develop: a man, two mules, a wooden plow, and behind them the 20th century receding like a bad memory. He knew the man. Everyone in Barton County knew Silas Brennan. Owned 120 acres on the south edge where his father had farmed before him. Kept to himself, mostly. Showed up at church on Sundays, nodded to folks at the feed store, paid his bills in cash. But this plowing with mules in 1970, this was something else entirely. Harlan set the photograph on his dashboard to finish developing and drove the remaining 4 miles to Lamar Feed and Supply. The store smelled of cracked corn and leather oil, and the men gathered around the coffee pot turned when the bell above the door announced his arrival. Harlan held up the Polaroid like a hunter displaying his kill. The first man to look let out a low whistle. Someone else laughed a short bark of disbelief. Within seconds, a half-dozen farmers crowded around the photograph, passing it hand to hand as if it might be a forgery. One of them finally spoke. "That's Silas Brennan." Another voice amused, "In 1970. Harlan leaned against the counter, enjoying the moment. "Drove past his place 10 minutes ago. Saw it with my own eyes. 2 mules, a wooden plow turning soil like it's 1870. Couldn't believe it myself." The men studied the photograph. They'd all seen Silas around town, driving his ancient pickup, buying supplies with bills pulled from a worn wallet. But this was different. This was proof of something they'd long suspected: Silas Brennan had never truly left the 19th century. He'd merely tolerated the 20th, waiting for it to pass like a brief, uncomfortable season. Dale Hostetler, who farmed 180 acres north of town, shook his head. "My grandfather plowed with mules. Died in 1952. I thought that era died with him." Harlan's voice carried across the store. "Some men are afraid of the future. Silas Brennan is terrified of it." Laughter rippled through the group. The photograph made its way around the circle again, each man taking another look, confirming what seemed impossible. Outside, diesel trucks rumbled past. Inside, they stared at an image that belonged in a museum. Someone suggested a nickname, and it stuck immediately: Mule Man Silas. By sunset, half the county would know. By Sunday service, everyone would. The photograph would circulate through Lamar like currency passed from hand to hand. A joke made physical proof that some men simply refused to change, no matter how fast the world spun around them. What none of them knew what the photograph couldn't capture was that in Silas Brennan's barn, covered by canvas tarps and hidden from casual view, sat 3 tractors. A 1946 Farmall H, a 1952 Farmall 350, a 1964 Farmall 560, all maintained with obsessive care, all capable of starting on the first turn of the key, all waiting for a moment that only Silas believed would come. And in a metal lockbox at the Lamar Farmers Bank, in an account under Silas's name alone, $41,000 accumulated across 24 years of patient saving, 24 years of choosing mules over machinery, discipline over comfort, mockery over debt. But Harlan Voss couldn't photograph what he couldn't see. Neither could the men laughing in the feed store. They saw only the surface: a backward farmer, a stubborn fool, a man trapped in the past while the future thundered by on 4-lane highways and rocket ships. They would learn different. But not yet. First they would laugh. The story of Silas Brennan began 31 years before that photograph in 1915, when the world was younger and farms still ran on muscle and patience rather than petroleum. He came into the world in the same farmhouse where his father Cornelius Brennan had lived since 1898. The farmhouse sat on 120 acres of prairie ground that Cornelius had bought for $40 an acre, land that rolled gently under Missouri skies and grew corn and soybeans if you worked it right. Cornelius Brennan was a German immigrant who'd arrived in America with $16 and a belief that land ownership meant freedom in a way that factory wages never could. He'd worked on other men's farms for 7 years, saving every penny possible, sleeping in barns, and eating 1 meal a day until he had enough to buy his own ground. The day he signed the deed, he was 30 years old and owned nothing but debt and possibility. The day he died in 1943, he owned 120 acres, free and clear, with equipment that worked and fences that stood straight. He farmed with mules, a matched pair named Solomon and Sheba, replaced by other matched pairs as the years passed, but always mules. Never horses too delicate, never oxen too slow. Mules could work from dawn until dusk in Missouri. He'd survive on forage that would starve other animals and live 25 years if you treated them with respect. Cornelius Brennan respected his mules the way other men respected their tractors as tools essential to survival. Silas grew up behind those mules. By age 6, he could read their moods from the twitch of an ear or the set of their shoulders. By 10, he could harness them alone. By 15, he could plow a straight furrow across 40 acres without breaking rhythm, the muscles in his back and legs, learning the cadence that his father had learned from men who farmed before tractors existed. Cornelius taught him more than farming. He taught him suspicion of debt, wariness of promises, skepticism toward anything that required you to depend on forces beyond your control. Banks failed, the Depression had proved that. Governments changed policies, markets collapsed, but land endured. And a man who owned his land outright, who could feed his animals from his own fields and fix his own equipment, was as close to free as anyone could get in a world designed to extract dependence. The phrase Silas heard most often throughout his childhood, "A mule won't leave you stranded when supplies run out. A bank will." Cornelius repeated it like scripture. When neighbors bought tractors in the 1920s, when the first John Deeres rumbled across county fields, when other farmers started talking about horsepower measured in engines instead of animals, Cornelius kept his mules and his independence. He watched men sign loan papers for shiny equipment, watched them make payments month after month, watched some of them lose everything when the Depression hit, and those payments came due with no money to meet them. Silas absorbed the lessons. He watched his father maintain equipment that never broke because it was simple enough to understand and repair. He watched neighbors struggle with tractors that needed parts shipped from factories hundreds of miles away, parts that cost real money instead of the sweat equity required to keep mules healthy. He learned that freedom and comfort were different things, and that his father had chosen freedom every single time. Then came December 7th, 1941, and the world changed again. Silas was 26 years old, unmarried, and strong as hardwood. The recruiting office in Lamar processed his paperwork in January 1942. By February, he wore a uniform and answered to sergeants who didn't care that he could plow 40 acres in a day or fix a broken harness with leather scraps and waxed thread. The Army looked at his background and assigned him to the Transportation Corps. Not driving trucks, though he learned that too, but handling mules. Because the Army still used mules, thousands of them, especially in terrain where trucks couldn't function. The mountains of Italy were roads twisted along cliff edges and supplies had to reach troops fighting in elevations that made engines gasp and wheeze. That's where mules proved their worth again. Silas spent 2 years in the Apennine Mountains leading mule trains through country that hadn't changed much since Roman legions marched through. He carried ammunition, food, medical supplies, all of it strapped to mules that climbed paths too narrow for vehicles. He learned Italian curse words and the names of villages destroyed by artillery. He watched men die from wounds and weather and simple bad luck. But he also watched supply lines stretch and break, watched convoys of trucks abandoned for lack of fuel, watched operations halt because gasoline didn't arrive when promised, didn't arrive at all, leaving men stranded with useless machinery while the war continued around them. December 1943. A night Silas would remember for the rest of his life. His unit had delivered supplies to a forward position, artillery shells and medical kits, hauled up a mountain path that took 6 hours to climb. On the way down, they passed a convoy of 15 trucks American-made parked in a ravine. No fuel. The trucks had run dry 40 miles from the nearest depot, and the fuel trucks that were supposed to meet them had been diverted to another sector. 30 soldiers were pinned down 3 miles away needing ammunition that sat in the backs of those useless trucks. By the time fuel arrived 2 days later, 23 of those soldiers were dead. Silas's mule train, meanwhile, kept walking. The mules ate dried grass and whatever forage they could find. They drank from streams. They carried what they could carry, and never stopped because of something that hadn't arrived from 1,000 miles away. That night, sitting beside a fire with his mules picketed nearby, Silas understood something that would shape the next 50 years of his life. Dependence was the enemy. Not Germans, not weather, not even bad luck. The real enemy was needing something you couldn't provide yourself, trusting a supply line you couldn't control, building a life on promises made by people who might not keep them. When the war ended and Silas came home in October 1945, his father was 2 years dead. Heart attack while mending fence, according to the neighbor who'd found him. The same neighbor had kept the farm running in exchange for half the crops, an arrangement Silas honored through the final harvest before taking full control. The farm waited for him exactly as his father had left it: 120 acres of barn, a farmhouse equipment that worked, and mules that needed feeding. Silas was 30 years old. He'd survived a war, and he knew with absolute certainty that the lesson he'd learned in Italy was the lesson his father had tried to teach him all along. Never depend on what you can't control. He met Edith Whitfield at a church social in November 1945, 3 weeks after returning home. She taught 5th grade at Lamar Elementary School, lived in a room above the hardware store, and carried herself with the careful dignity of a woman who'd learned early that independence meant not waiting for rescue. 28 years old and unmarried, which in Barton County in 1945 marked her as either too particular or too unlucky, though anyone who spoke with her for more than 5 minutes understood she was neither. Her fiancé had died at Normandy in June 1944, a fact she mentioned once and never again. She wore no ring. She answered questions about marriage plans with polite deflection. She taught her students to read and write and think, and she went home each evening to a quiet room where she corrected papers and imagined a future that looked nothing like what she'd planned before the war. Silas noticed her across the church basement because she wasn't laughing at the stories the other veterans were telling. Most of the women gathered around the men who'd come home asking questions and gasping at the right moments as the men shaped their war into narratives suitable for church socials. Edith stood near the coffee urn listening but separate, and when one veteran started describing a firefight with theatrical gestures, she turned away. Silas walked over. The words came out simpler than he intended. "You're not interested in war stories." She looked at him directly, the kind of eye contact that suggested she was used to evaluating people quickly. "I'm interested in truth, but I don't think that's what most of them are telling." He felt something settle in his chest, a recognition of similarity. Most of them are telling the version they wish had happened. She smiled, then brief, but genuine. "What version do you tell?" He thought about the trucks in the ravine, the supplies that never arrived, the men who died waiting. "I don't." They talked for an hour. She asked about his plans for the farm. He asked about her students. Neither of them mentioned the war again, though it sat between them like a third person at the table acknowledged by its absence. When the social ended and people started pulling on coats against the November cold, Silas heard himself asking if he could walk her home. They married in June 1946. Small ceremony, immediate family only, though Silas's father was already dead and Edith's parents had passed during the Depression. The church was the same one where they'd met. The reception lasted 2 hours. By sunset, they were back at the farmhouse, and Edith was looking around at the rooms that would be her home, taking inventory of what needed changing and what could stay. She'd grown up in town, daughter of a pharmacist and a piano teacher. She knew nothing about farming and had no illusions that love meant automatic compatibility, but she'd watched enough marriages collapse during the Depression to understand what mattered: dependability, honesty, shared purpose. Silas offered all three. He wasn't romantic in the way books describe romance. He didn't write poetry or make grand gestures, but he fixed the leak in her boarding house roof without being asked, and he listened when she talked about her students' struggles, and he never once suggested she should quit teaching after they married. She continued at the elementary school through the spring of 1947, riding into town with Silas each morning and riding back each evening. The schoolchildren learned to recognize the sound of his truck, the particular rattle of the engine that meant Miss Whitfield, now Mrs. Brennan, though some of the older students still slipped, was arriving for another day. When she became pregnant in the fall, she taught through April, and then resigned as was expected. The school board thanked her for her service. Her replacement was a young woman fresh from normal school who knew nothing about teaching but would work for less money. Edith packed her classroom supplies into boxes and came home to the farm, permanently trading lesson plans for garden plots and students' essays for the particular solitude of a farmhouse 3 miles from town. Their son arrived in May 1947 during a thunderstorm that knocked out power across the county. The doctor made it from town in time, but barely. They named him Caleb after Edith's grandfather, and he screamed with impressive volume from his first breath. For a few months, Edith allowed herself to imagine that marriage had delivered exactly what she'd hoped for: stability, purpose, a future that made sense. Silas worked the farm. She managed the household. Caleb grew. The rhythm seemed sustainable, even pleasant. Then Silas bought the tractor, and everything Edith thought she understood about her husband turned strange. It happened in September 1946, 3 months after their wedding and 8 months before Caleb's birth. Silas drove to Harlan Voss's new John Deere dealership on the east edge of Lamar and walked the showroom floor with the careful attention of a man making a serious decision. He asked questions about fuel consumption, maintenance schedules, parts availability. He examined the Farmall H with the thoroughness of a livestock buyer checking teeth and hooves. Harlan Voss, sensing a sale, deployed his full arsenal of persuasion. The Farmall H could plow 5 acres in the time it took Mules to plow 2. It never got tired, never went lame, never needed rest. The monthly payments were manageable for any working farmer. The government was even offering special loans to veterans' recognition for their service, a chance to modernize and build the future they'd fought to protect. Silas listened to it all. Then he pulled out a roll of bills held together with a rubber band and counted out $1,350 in cash. Payment in full. No loans, no payments. The money came from his Army savings plus what his father had left in the farm's operating account. Harlan Voss stopped talking mid-sentence and wrote the receipt. Edith was in the garden when Silas drove up with the tractor. She heard the engine before she saw it, a sound completely different from his truck, deeper and more powerful. She came around the side of the house, wiping soil from her hands, and stopped when she saw it, red paint gleaming in the afternoon sun, chrome exhaust pipe catching the light. Silas sitting in the seat with something approaching pride on his usually impassive face. Her first thought was joy. Her husband was finally joining the modern world. The neighbors who'd whispered about Silas's old-fashioned ways would have to revise their opinions. The tractor meant progress, prosperity, a future that looked forward instead of backward. She walked over to admire it properly. "You bought a tractor." Silas climbed down, already running his hand along the hood the way some men touched horses. "Farmall H. Same model Jim Peterson bought last year." She could hear the satisfaction in his voice, subtle but present. "This is wonderful, Si, really. We can farm so much more efficiently now." He nodded, but something in his expression suggested the conversation wasn't finished. "Going to test it this fall. See how it performs. Keep records." She assumed he meant records like any farmer would keep: hours, worked acres, plowed, yields achieved. She didn't yet understand that Silas Brennan kept records the way an accountant kept ledgers documenting every penny spent with obsessive precision because freedom required knowing exactly what everything cost. He used the tractor through the entire 1947 season. Every day he recorded data in a spiral notebook that he kept in the barn, fuel consumption measured to the tenth of a gallon, hours of operation, maintenance performed, repairs needed. He noted that the tractor burned 2.3 gallons per hour at 19 cents per gallon, which meant fuel costs alone ran 44 cents per hour of operation. Add oil filters and wear on parts, and the operating cost came to $2.65 per acre plowed. He also maintained careful records on the mules. Jack and Jenny, a matched pair he'd bought in 1945, ate hay and oats that Silas grew on his own land. The cash cost for their feed came to perhaps 30 cents per acre, most of it in the form of opportunity cost. The hay he fed them was hay he couldn't sell. But they produced manure that fertilized his fields, and they would work for 15 years without needing to be replaced. By December 1947, Silas had enough data to make projections. If fuel prices stayed at 19 cents per gallon, the tractor would pay for itself in 7 years and would be more economical than mules over any timeline longer than a decade. But the projection relied entirely on stable fuel costs. If gasoline jumped to 30 cents per gallon, a 58% increase, the tractor's advantage disappeared. If it hit 50 cents, the mules became clearly superior. If it reached $1 per gallon, which seemed impossible but wasn't theoretically beyond reach, the tractor would be economically catastrophic. Silas remembered the trucks in Italy, remembered supply lines that broke without warning, remembered prices that meant nothing when the supplies simply didn't exist. In April 1948, he drove the Farmall H into the barn, parked it in the back corner, and draped it with a canvas tarp. Then he walked out to the pasture where Jack and Jenny grazed and spent an hour fixing their harnesses, preparing them for the spring planting that they would perform exactly as they had the year before and the decade before that. Edith watched from the kitchen window, watched her husband cover the tractor they'd bought barely 18 months earlier, watched him hitch the mules to equipment that belonged in a museum. And for the first time since marrying Silas Brennan, she felt something close to fear. She waited until evening, until Caleb was asleep and the house was quiet except for the sounds old buildings made when settling into darkness. Silas sat at the kitchen table repairing a leather strap, his hands moving with the automatic precision of long practice. The question came out sharper than she intended. "Why do we buy a tractor if you're not going to use it?" He didn't look up from his work. "I am using it, just not the way you expected." She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down hard enough that he did look up, then recognizing the sound as anger barely contained. "Silas, people are going to talk. They're already talking. Everyone knows we bought that tractor. Everyone's going to notice when we're still plowing with mules." He set down the strap and gave her his full attention, which somehow made everything worse because she could see he'd already considered every point she was about to make and had decided they didn't matter. Let them talk. The words hung between them. Let them talk. As if the opinions of their neighbors, their community, the people they'd see at church and the feed store and every other public place, as if all of that was simply irrelevant compared to whatever plan he'd formed in that quiet, calculating mind of his. She tried again, forcing herself to speak calmly. "I don't understand. We spent $1,350 on that tractor. That's real money. Money we could have used for 100 other things. And now it's just sitting in the barn under a tarp while you're out there plowing with animals." He nodded, acknowledging the accuracy of her summary. "I have a plan, Edie." She waited for elaboration. When it didn't come, she prompted, "What plan?" He seemed to consider how much to explain, how much she'd understand or accept. Finally, "Fuel prices will spike eventually. Maybe not this year. Maybe not for 10 years. But they will. And when they do, land will be cheap because farmers who can't afford to run their tractors will have to sell. That's when we buy." The explanation made a kind of sense, the way a map makes sense if you already know where you're going. But Edith was still lost in the present, in the reality of being married to a man who'd just told her they'd wait a decade, maybe more, for a catastrophe that might never come, all while being mocked by everyone they knew. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted. "What if fuel prices never spike? What if you're wrong?" He picked up the leather strap again, resuming his repair work. "Then Caleb inherits a farm with no debt, 3 working tractors, and whatever money we've saved. He'll have choices I never had." She understood then that this wasn't a conversation. This was a notification. Silas had already decided. The tractor would stay under its tarp. The mules would do the work. And Edith would stand beside her husband while the county laughed at them both, trusting a plan she couldn't see and a future that made sense only to the man she'd married. She stood and walked to the bedroom without another word. Behind her she heard the small sounds of leather and waxed thread, Silas finishing his repair work in the kitchen that would be the center of their shared life for the next 4 decades. Outside, Jack and Jenny grazed in the pasture, unaware that they'd just been chosen to carry not just a plow, but the weight of a strategy that wouldn't pay off for 30 years. The pattern repeated. In 1952, Silas bought a Farmall 350 for $2,650. Harlan Voss wrote the receipt with undisguised confusion, remembering the Farmall H that Silas had purchased 6 years earlier and apparently never used. This time Harlan didn't bother with the sales pitch. He just took the cash and watched Silas drive the tractor away. The Farmall 350 joined the Farmall H under tarps in the back of the barn. Silas added it to his maintenance rotation, starting both tractors, monthly changing oil, seasonally replacing parts before they failed. He kept detailed records of every expense: oil filters, spark plugs, belt replacements, the cost of preservation. In the 12 years between 1952 and 1964, he spent $847 maintaining 2 tractors he never actually used for farming. Meanwhile, Jack and Jenny pulled the plow. And in 1964, Silas bought a 3rd tractor, a Farmall 560 for $400, and parked it next to the others. The neighbors noticed. How could they not? 3 tractors purchased over 18 years, and Silas Brennan still farming with mules like it was 1890 instead of the mid-1960s when America was racing toward the moon and Vietnam and futures that bore no resemblance to the past. The mockery started casually. Jokes at the feed store about Silas collecting tractors like other men collected stamps. Comments at church socials about how some people just couldn't let go of the old ways. Gentle ribbing that gradually turned less gentle as the absurdity of the situation became clear to everyone except apparently Silas himself. Harlan Voss led the charge not out of malice exactly, but out of genuine bewilderment, mixed with the salesman's frustration at watching potential profit disappear into a barn and never emerge. At the feed store, at the bank, at every public gathering, Harlan would eventually work the conversation around to Silas Brennan and his bizarre collection of unused machinery. Bought 3 tractors from me over the years. 3, and you know what he uses them for ballast? Just sits them in his barn like ornaments. Meanwhile, he's out there plowing with mules. I've tried talking to him, but you might as well talk to a fence post. The story became local legend. Farmers from neighboring counties heard about Mule Man Silas and his barn full of pristine tractors. Some drove by hoping to catch a glimpse, though all they ever saw was the same sight: Silas behind his mules, moving at the pace of creatures who'd never heard of urgency, turning soil the way his father had and his father before him. For Edith, the mockery became unbearable, not because it was cruel, most of it wasn't, but because it never stopped. Every social interaction contained it, subtle or obvious. Every conversation eventually circled back to her husband's inexplicable behavior. Every woman who approached her at church did so with the particular tone reserved for discussing someone's embarrassing relative, a mixture of pity and curiosity. The other farm wives had husbands who took loans and bought equipment and expanded operations. They had new kitchen appliances, trips to St. Louis children who went to college on agricultural scholarships. Edith had a husband who hoarded tractors and plowed with animals and saved money with the grim determination of a man preparing for a catastrophe that everyone else considered impossible. She learned to deflect the questions. Silas has his reasons. She learned to change the subject. How are your grandchildren doing? She learned to leave gatherings early, pleading headaches or chores, anything to escape the looks and the whispers and the relentless grinding awareness that her husband was the county joke and she was the woman who'd married him. Caleb absorbed it too. Starting in 1st grade, the teasing began. Gentle at first questions about why his daddy used mules when everyone else had tractors, then sharper as children learned cruelty from their parents' conversations overheard at dinner tables. By 4th grade, Caleb came home most days with some new variation of the insult, some creative way his classmates had found to remind him that his father was different, strange, backward. He asked Edith why his father farmed that way. She gave him the answer Silas had given her. Your father is preparing for the future. Caleb, 9 years old and socially astute enough to recognize a non-answer, pressed harder. What future? Everyone says he's stuck in the past. Edith had no response that would satisfy a child who just wanted to be normal, who wanted a father who drove tractors like other fathers, who wanted to stop being the weird kid whose family did everything wrong. She brought it up with Silas again in 1959 on Christmas Eve after finding his bank book in the bedroom drawer. She hadn't meant to snoop. She'd been looking for the deed to the farm, needing it for some paperwork, and found instead the small ledger that documented every deposit Silas had made since 1946. The number stopped her cold: $4,850. 13 years of saving $25 per month, never missing a payment, letting it compound at the modest interest rates the Lamar Farmers Bank offered. 13 years of living without vacations or luxuries or any of the comforts that money could buy, all of it accumulating in an account that Silas checked quarterly and never touched. She sat on the edge of the bed, holding the bank book, doing calculations in her head. With $4,850, they could buy a new car, fix up the farmhouse, send Caleb to a better school, pay for music lessons or sports equipment or any of the 100 things that other families seem to afford without thinking twice. When Silas came in from evening chores, she held up the bank book without speaking. He saw it and stopped in the doorway, water still dripping from his hands where he'd washed at the pump. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Finally, his voice quiet. You weren't supposed to find that. The words came out before she could stop them. 13 years of frustration compressed into one question. Why are we living poor when we have this much saved? He crossed the room and sat beside her on the bed, close enough that she could smell the barn on his clothes and the cold December air on his skin. We're not poor, Edie. We have everything we need. She looked at him. This man she'd married, this stranger she'd lived with for 13 years without ever fully understanding. We could have a better life, a car, a vacation, things for Caleb. He took the bank book from her hands gently and set it on the nightstand. That money is our insurance. When fuel prices spike and farmers who can't afford to operate will sell. Land will be cheap. That's when we buy. She'd heard this explanation before, but tonight it sounded different. Tonight it sounded like insanity, like a man betting everything on a disaster that might never come. What if you're wrong, Silas? What if fuel prices never spike? What if we spend our whole lives waiting for something that never happens? He looked at her directly, his eyes serious in a way that reminded her why she'd married him, why beneath all the frustration there remained something solid and worthy of trust. Then we spend our lives with no debt. Free. That's worth more than a new car. She wanted to argue. Wanted to point out that freedom didn't mean much if you were isolated and mocked and watching your son grow up ashamed of his own father. But she was tired, and it was Christmas Eve, and somewhere in the house Caleb was probably still awake, listening to them discuss things he was too young to fully understand. Her voice came out smaller than intended. I trust you, Si, but it's hard. Being the wife of Mule Man, having everyone think we're crazy. He reached for her hand, a gesture rare enough that it carried weight. I know what I'm asking you to carry, and I know it's not fair, but I saw what happens when the supplies run out. I saw men die because they depended on things that didn't arrive. I won't build our lives that way. She squeezed his hand, accepting what she couldn't change. Promise me something. Promise me that if this works, if fuel prices spike and we buy land, promise me you'll finally use those tractors. That all of this waiting will have been for something. He nodded once, definite. I promise. When the time comes, the tractors will work, and you'll understand why we waited. She believed him because she had to. Because the alternative was accepting that she'd married a madman and wasted 13 years trusting a delusion. Because somewhere beneath the mockery and the isolation and the relentless strangeness of her life, she still recognized the man who'd walked her home from the church social in 1945, the man who'd listened when others were performing, the man who kept his promises, even when they took decades to fulfill. Outside, snow began to fall across Barton County. Inside, Silas and Edith Brennan sat together on their bed, holding hands in silence, waiting for a future that only one of them could see. The 1960s passed like a slow tide. Caleb grew from child to teenager, learning to hate the sound of his father's mules and the whispered comments that followed him through Lamar High School. Other kids had fathers who drove new pickups and took families to ball games and talked about expansion and progress. Caleb had Silas, who drove a 1954 Chevrolet truck with 180,000 miles, and Rust eating through the bed, who spoke rarely and smiled less, who seemed determined to prove that the entire 20th century was a mistake. Edith taught him to read before kindergarten, passed down her love of books and learning, hoped that education would be his escape route from a farm that increasingly felt like a prison of principles she couldn't fully embrace. Caleb absorbed it all. His mother's intelligence, his father's stubborn determination, the community's conviction that the Brennan family existed slightly out of phase with normal reality. In 1965, Harlan Voss opened a bigger dealership on the north side of Lamar. John Deere and International Harvester both roomed for 40 tractors on the lot, financing available to any farmer with reasonable credit. The boom years were building momentum, cheap loans, government subsidies, an agricultural economy that seemed capable of infinite expansion if you just had the courage to leverage your land and buy the equipment to work it properly. Dale Hostetler took the leap, borrowed $62,000 against his 180 acres, and bought another 420 acres of ground along with 3 tractors and a combine. Suddenly he was farming 600 acres, a legitimate operation respected and envied. His wife got a new kitchen, his kids got college funds, his future looked bright as Nebraska summer. Silas, meanwhile, bought his 3rd tractor and parked it in the barn. The joke evolved. Mule Man Silas wasn't just backward, he was mentally deficient, unable to grasp basic economics, clinging to the past with the desperation of a drowning man clutching driftwood. Harlan Voss told and retold the story of selling Silas 3 tractors over nearly 20 years and never seeing a single one leave the barn. The story got embellished with each telling until it achieved the status of legend, a cautionary tale about what happened when stubbornness replaced sense. At church on Palm Sunday, 1968, Edith overheard 2 women discussing Silas while standing in line for coffee. They didn't know she was behind them, or perhaps they didn't care. Patricia told me Silas bought another tractor last year, just parked it with the others. She said her husband saw all 3 of them lined up in that barn, covered with tarps like museum pieces. The other woman laughed softly. I'd feel sorry for Edith if she hadn't chosen this. She married him knowing what he was. Edith's hands tightened on her purse. She could correct them, defend her husband, explain about Italy and supply lines, and the plan that made perfect sense to Silas, even if nobody else understood it. But she'd learned over 22 years of marriage that defending the indefensible only invited more questions, more judgment, more proof that she was as strange as her husband. She left the line without getting coffee and found Silas in the parking lot, already waiting by the truck, having endured his own share of subtle mockery from the men gathered on the church steps discussing equipment and loans and the futures they were building on borrowed money. They drove home in silence, the way they drove home from most public events, exhausted by the effort of existing in a community that found them incomprehensible. That night, after Caleb had gone to bed, Edith brought it up again. How much longer, Si? He didn't need to ask what she meant. He'd been counting the years, too, watching fuel prices hover between 25 cents and 35 cents per gallon, stable enough to make him seem foolish and unstable enough to justify his caution. I don't know. But when it happens, you'll know I was right. She didn't argue. 22 years of marriage had taught her that Silas Brennan didn't change his mind once it was made up. She could accept it or leave, and she'd chosen acceptance so many times that leaving wasn't really an option anymore. Her life was bound to his for better or worse, and worse had lasted more than 2 decades without showing signs of transformation into better. What she didn't know, what nobody except Silas knew, was that by 1970, he'd saved $41,000 across 24 years of patient discipline, that the tractors in his barn represented not surrender to modernity, but preparation for opportunity, that everything he'd endured, everything he'd asked Edith and Caleb to endure, was building toward a moment that would either vindicate him completely or prove that he'd wasted half his life on a delusion. Spring, 1970 arrived. Harlan Voss drove past Silas's farm and saw Mules pulling a plow. He stopped and took a photograph that would circulate through Barton County like evidence in a trial proof that some men simply refused to learn. The photograph captured Silas Brennan at age 55, still farming the way his father had farmed, still trusting animals over engines, still waiting for the crisis he'd seen coming since 1943, when trucks ran dry in Italian mountains and men died because the supplies didn't arrive. 3 years later, the world would prove him right. But on that spring morning in 1970, all anyone could see was a man and his mules turning soil the old way, refusing progress, afraid of the future. Nobody saw the 3 tractors waiting in the barn. Nobody knew about the $41,000 in the bank. Nobody understood that patience was its own kind of courage, that waiting could be a strategy instead of cowardice, that the man they mocked might be the only sane person in a county rushing headlong toward a catastrophe they couldn't imagine. But they would learn. Time and oil prices would teach them. And when the lessons came, they would be expensive and permanent, and exactly what Silas Brennan had been preparing for since the day he came home from war and decided that freedom mattered more than fitting in. The photograph circulated, the laughter continued, and Silas kept plowing with his mules one furrow at a time, waiting for the world to catch up to what he'd already seen. The decade turned and farm equipment prices climbed with it. John Deere released the 4020 in 1964, a machine that could pull 8-bottom plows and work ground faster than anything farmers had seen before. International Harvester countered with bigger models. The competition drove innovation and debt in equal measure, and across Barton County, farmers made calculations that all reached the same conclusion: expand or die. Dale Hostetler sat in Harlan Voss's office in March 1967, studying loan papers that would reshape his entire operation. The numbers looked good on paper. At 5.25% interest, he could borrow $62,000 against his 180 acres and use the money to buy the Parker property, 420 acres of prime bottom ground that had been in receivership since old man Parker's death. Add 3 new tractors and a combine, and suddenly Dale would be farming 600 acres instead of 180. The economics made sense. The risk seemed manageable. Harlan pushed the papers across his desk. "You're looking at tripling your operation. Your kids will thank you when they inherit an actual farm instead of a hobby plot." Dale signed. The ink dried while Harlan counted out the cashier's checks, and within a week, Dale Hostetler owned 600 acres and enough equipment to work it. His wife got the kitchen remodel she'd been requesting for years. His daughter got a car for graduation. His future, everyone agreed, looked bright as Kansas wheat. Silas Brennan, meanwhile, still farmed 120 acres with Jack and Jenny. His savings account at Lamar Farmers Bank passed $50,000 in 1969 money that could have bought land equipment a future that looked like everyone else's. But he kept it there, accumulating interest at 3% annually, waiting for the moment he'd been preparing for since trucks ran dry in Italian mountains 25 years earlier. The contrast became more pronounced with each passing year. Modern farmers drove new pickups and talked expansion strategies and sent their children to agricultural colleges. Silas drove the same 1954 Chevrolet truck with 200,000 miles showing on the odometer, spoke only when necessary, and watched Caleb leave for the University of Missouri in September 1965, with instructions to study whatever interested him as long as it wasn't farming. Caleb studied agricultural economics, which wasn't farming exactly, but close enough to make Silas uncomfortable. The boy came home for Christmas breaks and tried to explain modern farming theory concepts like economies of scale and leverage ratios and optimal debt-to-equity positions. Silas listened politely and said nothing, recognizing that his son had absorbed the conventional wisdom that would doom half the farmers in Missouri within 15 years. Edith aged through those years with the quiet exhaustion of someone carrying weight that nobody else could see. The mockery hadn't stopped. It had simply become background noise as constant as wind and equally impossible to escape. Women at church still pitied her. Men at the feed store still joked about Silas and his museum of unused tractors. The county had collectively decided that the Brennans were harmless eccentrics too strange to understand, but not strange enough to shun completely. She developed headaches that lasted for days. The doctor in Lamar prescribed rest and aspirin and suggested that stress might be a factor. She didn't tell him about the specific stress of being married to a man whose every decision seemed calculated to maximize public humiliation. She took the aspirin and rested when she could and kept standing beside Silas at church socials because divorce wasn't an option and surrender wasn't in her nature. The summer of 1972 was particularly brutal. Temperatures hit 105 degrees in July and the corn withered in fields across the county. Dale Hostetler ran his irrigation system 18 hours a day, burning diesel at a rate that made his accountant nervous but kept his crops alive. Other farmers did the same, running equipment around the clock, fighting heat with horsepower and fuel. Silas irrigated with a system his father had built in 1938, powered by a windmill that pumped water from an underground spring. It worked slowly, required no fuel, and kept his 120 acres adequately watered through the worst of the heat. When other farmers asked how he managed without diesel pumps, he explained about the windmill and watched their faces register the information as confirmation of what they already believed. Silas Brennan lived in the past because he was afraid of the present. September brought relief from the heat, but not from the economic pressure. Grain prices were good, the best they'd been in years, and farmers who'd expanded were celebrating their foresight. Dale Hostetler's 600 acres produced enough soybeans to pay down 10% of his loan in a single harvest. He bought his wife a new car and started talking about buying even more ground. At the feed store in October, standing in line to pay for salt blocks, Dale encountered Silas for the first time in months. The conversation was brief but memorable for what it revealed about the gulf between their worldviews. Dale's voice carried the confidence of a man whose bets had paid off. "Silas, you're missing the opportunity of a lifetime. Land prices are climbing. If you'd leverage that 120 acres, you could be farming 400 acres by spring." Silas counted out cash for his purchase, exact change, nothing wasted. "Happy with 120? Dale laughed, the sound edged with something that might have been pity or contempt or both. "You're going to die farming the same acres your father farmed, never growing, never building anything bigger than what you inherited." Silas picked up his salt blocks and turned to leave. At the door he paused just long enough to offer one sentence: "Size doesn't matter if you don't own it." The words hung in the air after he left. Dale dismissed them as the defensive response of a man too scared to compete. But 3 other farmers in the store heard them and thought about their own loan payments, the monthly obligations that never stopped regardless of weather or grain prices or any of the 1,000 variables that made farming equal parts skill and gamble. One of them, an older farmer named Eugene who'd survived the Depression, watched Silas's truck pull away and said quietly, "That man knows something we don't." Dale shook his head. "He knows how to stay small and scared, that's all." 12 months later, Dale Hostetler would remember that conversation and understand exactly what Silas knew. The first hint came in October 1973, when radio stations started reporting tensions in the Middle East. The Yom Kippur War erupted on October 6th, and for most Americans it was just another foreign conflict, distant and irrelevant to daily life. Farmers in Missouri had more immediate concerns. Harvest was in full swing, grain prices remained strong, and the future looked stable enough to justify the debts they carried. Silas heard the news and felt something cold settle in his chest, a recognition that the moment he'd been waiting for might finally be arriving. He didn't share the feeling with Edith. She had enough to worry about without adding his suspicions to the burden. October 17, 1973. The Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries announced an oil embargo against the United States in retaliation for American support of Israel. The announcement came through on evening news broadcasts delivered by anchors who explained the geopolitics but couldn't quite convey the magnitude of what was about to happen. Within a week, gasoline prices jumped 20 cents per gallon. Within 2 weeks, they doubled. Service stations across Missouri started running dry, and when they did have fuel lines stretched for blocks, cars idling for hours just to fill their tanks. The government implemented rationing, odd-numbered license plates on certain days, even numbers on others, a system that felt un-American and necessary in equal measure. For farmers, the crisis was immediate and catastrophic. Everything in modern agriculture ran on petroleum. Tractors burned diesel, trucks hauled grain on gasoline. Combines needed fuel to harvest, and without harvest there was no income. And without income, the loan payments came due anyway. Dale Hostetler watched diesel prices climb from 45 cents per gallon in September to 95 cents by December. His fuel costs doubled literally overnight, and every acre he farmed became twice as expensive to work. The irrigation system that had saved his crops in the summer of 1972 now consumed diesel at rates that made him physically sick when he calculated the monthly totals. His accountant ran new projections in early December and delivered them in person, too serious to discuss over the phone. With fuel costs at current levels, Dale would lose money on every acre he farmed. His gross income from 600 acres might hit $85,000 in a good year, but fuel alone would cost $38,000, and that didn't include equipment maintenance, seed fertilizer, or the $6,200 annual loan payment. The math was simple and devastating. He was losing roughly $4,000 per year, bleeding equity with every harvest. Other farmers faced identical calculations. The men who'd expanded aggressively, who'd borrowed money to buy land and equipment, who'd built their operations on the assumption that 5-cent per gallon fuel price fluctuations were the worst volatility they'd ever face. Those men suddenly understood that they'd built houses on sand and the tide was coming in. The feed store became a gathering place for shared misery. Men who normally competed with each other now commiserated, comparing fuel bills and maintenance costs and the impossible arithmetic of farming when your operating expenses doubled in 8 weeks. Silas walked into Lamar Feed and Supply on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-December, needing fence staples and mineral supplements for Jack and Jenny. The conversation stopped when he entered a dozen farmers turning to look at him with expressions that ranged from resentment to something approaching awe. Eugene, the older farmer who'd noted Silas's prescience a year earlier, broke the silence. "How you managing Silas? Fuel costs must be hurting." Silas picked up a box of staples and examined it unnecessarily, buying time to consider his response. Don't use much fuel. The room absorbed this information slowly, men processing what they already knew, but hadn't quite connected to their current situation. Silas Brennan farmed with mules. Mules didn't need gasoline or diesel. Mules ate hay and oats, most of which Silas grew on his own land. While everyone else hemorrhaged money on fuel that cost twice what it had cost in September, Silas's operating expenses remained essentially unchanged. Dale Hostetler stood near the back of the store holding a receipt for diesel he'd just purchased at 98 cents per gallon. His voice came out harder than intended. You serious? You're still using those mules? Silas set down the staples and looked at Dale directly. Jack and Jenny don't care what oil costs in Saudi Arabia. Someone laughed, a short bark of sound that died immediately as the full implication landed. For 23 years, Dale and men like him had mocked Silas Brennan for farming with animals. They'd called him backward and scared and unable to adapt to modern agriculture. They joked about his unused tractors and his stubborn refusal to join the 20th century. Now standing in a feed store in December 1973 with fuel prices doubled and their profit margins evaporated, they understood that Silas hadn't been scared of the future. He'd been preparing for it. Eugene voiced what everyone was thinking. You knew this would happen. Silas shook his head slightly. Didn't know. Prepared for the possibility. Dale's face flushed red, anger, and embarrassment mixing into something that looked like pain. We all laughed at you, called you Mule Man like it was the funniest joke in the county. Silas paid for his staples, counting out exact change from bills worn soft with handling. People laugh at what they don't understand. Doesn't make them wrong or me right. Just makes us different. He left without saying more, and the farmers stood in silence after the door closed behind him. Outside, his 1954 Chevrolet truck started on the third try, coughing blue smoke, before settling into its familiar rough idle. They watched him drive away, and for the first time in 23 years, nobody laughed. Edith learned about the oil crisis from the radio before she understood what it meant for her specifically. She heard reports of gas lines and price spikes and political tensions in places she could barely locate on a map. The crisis seemed distant until women at church started talking about their husbands' fuel costs, and then suddenly it became personal. The conversation happened in the church kitchen after Sunday service, women preparing coffee and arranging cookies while their husbands stood outside discussing weather and politics and the catastrophe unfolding across American agriculture. Margaret Hostetler, Dale's wife, looked exhausted in a way that makeup couldn't hide. Dale spent $340 on diesel this week, just 1 week. I don't know how we're going to manage if prices stay this high. Another woman nodded sympathetically. Jim's talking about selling one of the tractors. Says we can't afford to run all of them anymore. They continued sharing horror stories, each woman contributing evidence that their comfortable middle-class farming lives were suddenly precarious. And then someone mentioned Silas, and the conversation shifted in a direction Edith hadn't experienced in 27 years of marriage. A younger woman, newer to the community, asked innocently, How's your husband managing? Is fuel affecting him like everyone else? Edith measured her response carefully, uncertain of the territory. Silas doesn't use much fuel. He still farms with mules. The room went quiet. The women looked at each other, and Edith saw something in their faces that she'd never seen before when discussing her husband. Respect. Not pity, not mockery, not the patronizing sympathy reserved for the hopelessly backward. Actual respect. Margaret set down her coffee cup harder than necessary. Your husband was right. All these years we thought he was crazy, but he was right. The words landed like absolution. 27 years of standing beside Silas while the county laughed, 27 years of enduring whispers and questions, and the relentless social pressure to convince her husband to modernize all of it, suddenly recontextualized into something that looked disturbingly like vindication. Edith felt tears threatening and forced them back. He was just being careful. Margaret laughed, but there was no humor in it. Careful. My husband borrowed $62,000 and called it smart. Your husband saved money and got called crazy. Seems like maybe we had it backward. The other women nodded, and for the first time in nearly 3 decades, Edith Brennan stood in a room of her peers and felt something other than isolation. She excused herself before the tears could come and found Silas in the parking lot waiting, as always patient as the mules he worked behind. She got in the truck without speaking, and they drove home through countryside where diesel tractors sat idle because their owners couldn't afford to run them. The irony was almost too perfect. The future had arrived, and it looked exactly like the past. Silas had never left. That night, after Caleb called from Columbia to check on them, he'd heard about the crisis, and worried, though his worry seemed oddly misdirected given that his parents were the only farmers in the county. Not bleeding money. Edith found Silas in the barn performing his monthly maintenance on the 3 tractors that still sat under their tarps. She watched him work for several minutes before speaking. I need to say something. He straightened oil can in hand and gave her his full attention. Her voice shook slightly. I'm sorry I doubted you. All those years. All the times I asked when you'd use the tractors, or when we'd live like normal people, or why you had to be so different from everyone else. I'm sorry. He set down the oil can and crossed to where she stood. Edie, you never doubted me. Not really. She shook her head, tears finally coming. I did. Maybe not out loud, but in my heart. I thought you were scared. Thought you were clinging to the past because you couldn't handle the present. He reached for her hands, his own stained with oil and rough from decades of work. You stood beside me when the whole county thought I was crazy. That's not doubt. That's trust. And trust is harder than belief. The distinction mattered somehow, the difference between believing someone was right and trusting them, even when you couldn't see how they possibly could be. She'd given him the harder gift, the more valuable one, and only now in a barn surrounded by unused machinery did she understand what it had cost him to ask for it. She leaned against him, breathing in the familiar smells of oil and leather and the particular scent of her husband after a day's work. What happens now? His answer came quietly, almost matter-of-fact. We wait a little longer. Fuel prices will stabilize eventually, but they won't go back to what they were. Some farmers will adapt, others will fail. When they fail, land will be cheap. That's when we buy. She pulled back to look at him directly. And then you'll use the tractors. He nodded once, definite. Then I'll use the tractors. She believed him because she'd spent 27 years learning to trust what she couldn't see, and that trust had finally been vindicated in the worst possible way for everyone except her family. The embargo ended in March 1974, but gasoline prices never returned to pre-crisis levels. The new normal settled around 65 cents per gallon, roughly double the September 1973 baseline. Diesel stabilized near 70 cents, and farmers adjusted to operating costs that had fundamentally transformed their economics. Dale Hostetler managed to survive 1974 by scaling back operations and taking a second mortgage on his house. He farmed 600 acres with less intensity, letting some ground lie fallow, reducing fertilizer applications, doing everything possible to minimize costs while still meeting loan obligations. His wife went back to teaching and the money helped, but it wasn't enough to restore the comfortable buffer they'd enjoyed before fuel costs doubled. Other farmers weren't as fortunate. In the spring of 1975, 3 operations in Barton County filed for bankruptcy. Land that had sold for $280 per acre in 1972 was now available for $190. Equipment auctions became monthly events, farmers selling tractors and combines to raise cash for loan payments, desperate men trading their futures for a few more months of survival. Silas watched it all with the detached interest of someone observing a natural disaster from safe ground. He felt no satisfaction in being proven right. The vindication came mixed with awareness that his neighbors were suffering, that families were losing farms held for generations, that his correctness cost others everything. In June 1975, he made Edith an offer that surprised them both. They sat at the kitchen table after dinner, the June heat making the house uncomfortable despite open windows. Caleb was in Columbia taking summer classes, planning for a future that probably wouldn't include farming. The house felt empty in a way it hadn't when their son was younger. Silas pushed aside his plate and looked at Edith with unusual directness. I want to give you a choice. She set down her coffee cup, immediately wary. Silas didn't offer choices. He made decisions and explained them afterward, a pattern established over 29 years of marriage. His voice stayed calm but carried weight. We can sell everything. The farm, the tractors, the equipment. Take the money, should be close to $200,000 with the savings, and retire. Move to Florida if you want. You could teach part-time. I could fish. We'd have the life you imagined when you married me. Edith stared at him, genuinely shocked. The farm was everything to Silas. It was his father's legacy, his own identity, the foundation of every decision he'd made since coming home from the war. Offering to sell it was like offering to cut off his own arm. She found her voice, though it came out smaller than intended. You'd give up the farm. His expression didn't change. I'd give up anything for you. You've waited 29 years while everyone mocked us. You've been patient when you didn't understand why. You've trusted me when trust was the hardest thing I could ask. If you want to enjoy life now instead of waiting for a plan that might take another decade to pay off, I'll sell tomorrow. The offer sat between them like a gift she'd wanted desperately for years, but now that it was available, realized she didn't want anymore. Something had changed during the oil crisis, some fundamental shift in how she understood their life together. Silas hadn't been punishing her with his stubbornness. He'd been protecting her with his preparation. She let 3 days pass before answering 3 days of imagining what Florida would look like, what it would mean to leave Missouri and the farm and the strange, isolated life they'd built. She imagined teaching in schools where nobody knew about Mule Man Silas, living in a place where they could be anonymous and normal. And she realized she didn't want normal. Not anymore. Not when normal meant giving up before the plan was complete. On the third evening, she found him in the barn, maintaining tractors that still waited for the moment he'd promised they would arrive. She walked up behind him and spoke clearly enough that there could be no misunderstanding. No, we finish this together. He turned oil rag in hand, expression careful. Edie. She cut him off. I don't want Florida. I don't want to retire. I want you to win. The word came out harder than she intended, but it captured what she meant. This wasn't about being right anymore. Wasn't about proving anything to the neighbors who'd mocked them. This was about completing what they'd started, about seeing through to the end, a strategy that had cost them both almost everything. Her voice gentled. Not because I need validation. Not because I want to gloat. Because you deserve it. You've been patient for 29 years. I can be patient 5 more. Something in his face shifted, emotion breaking through the usual reserve. You're sure? She stepped closer and took the oil rag from his hands. I'm sure. We finish what we started. We buy land when it's cheap.
We use those tractors you've been maintaining for 30 years. We build something Caleb can inherit without debt. We do what you've been planning since you came home from Italy."
He pulled her close, then an embrace rare enough that it carried the weight of everything they couldn't say out loud. They stood together in the barn between unused tractors and stored equipment holding each other, while outside the sun set over land they'd defended through mockery and crisis and 29 years of waiting. The offer to sell was never mentioned again. The plan continued. And Edith Brennan, who'd spent 3 decades trusting what she couldn't see, finally understood that her husband's greatest gift wasn't being right about fuel prices. It was being willing to give it all up if she asked. The years between 1975 and 1979 passed with deceptive stability. Fuel prices hovered between 65 and 75 cents per gallon, high enough to strain farm budgets, but stable enough to allow adaptation. Farmers who'd survived the initial shock learned to operate on tighter margins. Some sold land, others consolidated. A few thrived by finding efficiencies that the cheap fuel era had made unnecessary. Dale Hostetler held on through a combination of luck, skill, and his wife's teaching income. He paid down debt, slowly reduced his operation to 450 acres, and made peace with the reality that he'd never achieved the expansion he'd dreamed about in 1967. The experience aged him visibly, adding gray to his hair and lines to his face that suggested permanent worry. Silas, meanwhile, continued farming his 120 acres with Jack and Jenny, saving money with the same discipline he'd maintained for 33 years. His account at Lamar Farmers Bank passed $72,000 in 1978 money that could have bought him comfort or respect or any number of things that other people valued. But he let it accumulate because comfort meant less than preparation and respect from people who didn't understand his strategy was worthless anyway. Caleb graduated from the University of Missouri in May 1977 with a degree in agricultural economics and immediately took a job with the USDA in Kansas City. He visited the farm twice a year, Christmas and occasional summer weekends, and each visit revealed the growing distance between his world and his father's. Caleb lived in an apartment complex and worked in an office and dated women who'd never touched farm equipment. His life was clean and modern and built on the kind of regular paycheck that farmers could only dream about. Edith watched her son drift away without knowing how to stop it. She'd encouraged his education, pushed him toward choices that would free him from the isolation she'd endured. Now he was free, and the freedom looked like disconnection from everything his parents had built. In January 1979, radio stations started reporting revolution in Iran. The Shah fled. Ayatollah Khomeini took power. And within weeks, the second oil shock hit with force that made the 1973 crisis look like a minor disruption. Gasoline prices jumped from 70 cents to $1.20 by June. By September, they'd hit $1.60. By December, $1.85 per gallon, and diesel climbed to $1.70. The increases happened so fast that farmers couldn't adjust, couldn't plan, couldn't do anything except watch their operating costs triple in less than a year. Dale Hostetler sat in his kitchen on a December evening surrounded by account books and receipts and the undeniable mathematics of failure. His wife stood at the sink washing dishes, both of them avoiding the conversation they needed to have. Finally, he spoke into the silence. "I can't make January's payment." She turned water dripping from her hands. "How short are we?" He laughed a sound without any humor. "Not short. Broke. My fuel cost went from $18,000 a year to $38,000. The loan payment is $6,200 annually. I'm losing money on every acre I farm. I can't make the payment this month, next month, or any month until something fundamental changes." The bank foreclosed in February 1980. Dale Hostetler lost 450 acres that his grandfather had broken with horse-drawn plows in 1919, land that had supported 3 generations of his family ground, that he'd leveraged and expanded and ultimately lost because he'd believed in a future that required oil to stay cheap forever. He wasn't alone. By March 1987, farms in Barton County faced foreclosure. Banks that had eagerly written agricultural loans in the late 1960s now found themselves holding land they didn't know how to farm and couldn't sell at prices anywhere near the outstanding debt. The feed store became a place of shared grief. Men who'd competed with each other now united in commiseration, comparing bank notices and auction dates, and the particular humiliation of losing everything to forces completely beyond their control. Silas walked in one afternoon in late February needing supplies and encountered Eugene near the coffee pot. The older farmer looked at him with an expression that mixed respect and something darker. Eugene's voice came out quiet. "You warned us. Not directly, but you showed us. We just didn't see it." Silas poured coffee into a paper cup. Nobody could predict this specific crisis, just knew that dependency was dangerous. Eugene nodded slowly. "Dale Hostetler's losing everything. Auction set for March 1st. 600 acres going on the courthouse steps." The information landed exactly as Silas expected. He'd been watching land prices decline, tracking auctions, doing calculations that suggested the moment he'd been waiting for was finally here. That evening he spread papers across the kitchen table while Edith watched. Bank statements, property tax records, auction notices, the accumulated evidence of opportunity born from other people's catastrophe. His finger traced numbers on a ledger. "Dale's land should sell for $180 to $200 per acre. We have $77,500 in savings. We can buy 200 acres cash if prices come in at the low end."
Edith studied the papers, understanding the implications. You've been waiting 34 years for this. He nodded. Since Italy. Since the trucks ran dry and men died waiting for supplies that didn't come. Since I understood that the only real security is owning what you need and not depending on what you can't control. She reached across the table and took his hand. Then let's finish what we started. The auction was scheduled for March 1st, 1980, on the courthouse steps in Lamar. Silas marked the date on his calendar and prepared to bid on land that his neighbor was losing to the same crisis he'd predicted 3.5 decades earlier. The vindication tasted like ashes mixed with necessity victory that came from other people's failure, but he'd prepared for this moment too long to let guilt stop him now. The land would be sold regardless. Someone would buy it. Better that it went to a man who could farm it without debt than to some out-of-state investor who'd hold it for speculation. He checked his tractors one more time. All three started immediately, engines turning over smooth as silk despite years under tarps. The 1946 Farmall H, the 1952 Farmall 350, the 1964 Farmall 560, all maintained perfectly, all waiting for the work they'd been purchased to perform. The work was finally here. March 1st. 1980 dawned cold and clear across Missouri. Silas woke at his usual time, performed morning chores with Jack and Jenny, and dressed in his church clothes, the only suit he owned, purchased for his wedding 34 years earlier, and still fitting reasonably well despite the decades. Edith made breakfast and said little. They both understood what the day meant. The culmination of a plan that had dominated their entire marriage, shaped every decision, cost them social acceptance and normal comfort and anything resembling an ordinary life. The courthouse in Lamar filled early. 200 people came to watch, most of them spectators rather than bidders. Foreclosure auctions drew crowds, the way accidents drew rubberneckers, people wanting to witness catastrophe from safe distance while privately thanking God it wasn't happening to them. Dale Hostetler stood near the back, required to attend the sale of his own land. He looked smaller than Silas remembered, diminished by the process of losing everything. His wife stood beside him, both of them watching strangers prepare to bid on ground they'd worked for decades. The auctioneer, a professional from Springfield, who handled agricultural liquidations across 3 counties, explained the terms 450 acres divided into 3 parcels. Minimum bid set by the bank, holding the mortgage payment due within 30 days. The first parcel comprised 200 acres of prime bottom ground, the best land Dale owned. The auctioneer started at $220 per acre, and when nobody bid, he dropped to $200. Still silence. He went lower, $190, $180. At $180, a man from Kansas City raised his hand. He represented an investment group buying agricultural land in distressed markets, planning to hold until prices recovered. Silas bid $185. The room went completely quiet. Everyone knew Silas Brennan. Everyone knew he farmed 120 acres with mules and hadn't expanded his operation in 4 decades. His participation in the auction registered as news evidence that perhaps the crisis was bad enough to force even the most conservative farmer to take risks. The Kansas City investor bid $190. Silas countered at $195. The investor paused, consulted papers on his clipboard, and shook his head. He was out. The auctioneer called it sold to Silas Brennan for $195 per acre. 200 acres. Total purchase price $39,000. Silas signed the papers. Right there, wrote a check from Lamar Farmers Bank that represented most of his liquid savings and became the owner of 320 acres instead of 120. The crowd murmured, processing the information, trying to understand how Mule Man Silas, the joke of Barton County, the farmer everyone had mocked for being backward and scared, had just paid cash for 200 acres while men who'd borrowed and expanded and modernized were losing everything. Dale Hostetler approached after the auction ended, his face unreadable. He stopped in front of Silas, and for a long moment neither man spoke. Finally, Dale's voice came out rough. "Thank you for not stealing it. You could have waited and bid $150. Would have gotten it." Silas met his eyes directly. "You worked that land honestly. Deserves a fair price." Dale's jaw tightened. "I called you Mule Man for 20 years. Made jokes about your tractors and your mules and how you'd never amount to anything. And you just paid me fair price for land I'm losing because I was too stupid to see what you saw." Silas didn't flinch from the pain in Dale's voice. "You weren't stupid. You did what made sense with the information available. Just happened that I had different information." Dale shook his head. "Italy. You saw supply lines fail. You knew it could happen again. And instead of just protecting yourself, you've spent 40 years preparing for this exact moment." The accuracy of the statement didn't require confirmation. Silas had indeed spent 40 years preparing, and the preparation was finally paying off in the most painful possible way. Dale's voice dropped lower. "What am I going to do now? I'm 52 years old. Farming is all I know. And I just lost everything my grandfather built." Silas considered the question carefully before answering. "You can work for me. I need help managing 320 acres with tractors I haven't used in 34 years. Pay is fair, housing included. No shame in it." Dale stared at him, processing an offer that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. The man he'd mocked was now offering him employment, offering rescue from complete destitution, offering dignity when Dale had every right to expect humiliation. Something broke in Dale's face, emotion finally overwhelming the control he'd maintained through the auction. "Why would you do that? After everything I said about you?" Silas's answer came simple and direct. "Because you need work, and I need help. Past is past." Dale nodded, unable to speak, and walked away before tears could start. He'd accepted the offer without saying yes, both of them understanding that words weren't necessary when the alternative was hunger. The second and third parcels of Dale's land sold to other buyers, investors, and neighboring farmers, picking through the remains. Silas left the courthouse with the deed to 200 acres in his pocket and a plan forming for how to farm 320 acres with equipment that had sat idle for decades. He drove home and found Edith waiting in the kitchen, anxiety written across her face until she saw his expression and understood that it had worked exactly as he'd predicted. Her voice trembled slightly. "You got it." He set the deed on the table between them. 200 acres, paid $195 per acre. Total cost, $39,000. We have about $38,000 left in savings. She picked up the deed and studied it like she was reading a foreign language, trying to comprehend that the piece of paper represented something impossible made real. Her husband, the man everyone had mocked for being backward, had just tripled their operation while paying cash and keeping enough in reserve to survive any foreseeable crisis. The tears came then, not from sadness, but from exhaustion, finally released. 34 years of standing beside Silas while the county laughed. 34 years of trusting what she couldn't see and defending decisions she didn't fully understand. 34 years of believing that somehow, eventually, it would all make sense. She looked up at him through tears. "You were right. About all of it." He crossed the room and pulled her close. "We were right. You stood with me when standing alone would have been easier. This is yours as much as mine." They held each other in the kitchen where they'd shared thousands of meals and countless difficult conversations, where they'd raised a son and weathered a marriage that looked nothing like what either of them had imagined on their wedding day. The deed lay on the table beside them, proof that patience wasn't weakness, and that sometimes the longest road led exactly where it needed to go. The next morning, Silas walked into his barn and pulled the tarps off all three tractors. The Farmall H started on the second try. The Farmall 350 and 560 fired up immediately. All three engines ran smooth and powerful, maintained for 34 years by a man who understood that preparation required action, even when the action seemed pointless to everyone watching. He backed them out into the March sunlight one by one, lined them up in front of the barn. The red paint had faded slightly under the tarps, but the chrome gleamed and the engines purred, and everything essential worked perfectly. Edith came out to watch, wrapped in a coat against the morning chill. She'd seen these tractors purchased over the years, watched them disappear under canvas, listened to Silas maintain them monthly while using mules for actual work. Now they sat in the sun, ready finally for the purpose they'd been bought to serve. He walked over to stand beside her, both of them looking at machinery that represented faith made physical. "Going to need to learn how to run these properly. Been 40 years since I used a tractor for real work." She smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen on her face in years. "You'll figure it out. You always do." He reached for her hand. "Dale Hostetler starts Monday. Going to teach me everything he knows about modern farming with modern equipment. Strange world we're living in." She squeezed his fingers. "Strange but fair. You prepared. He didn't. Now you help him anyway. That's who you are." They stood together watching three tractors idle in the morning sun, engines finally performing the work they'd been maintained to do. Somewhere in the county, other farmers were facing auctions and foreclosures and the end of generational farms. But here, on 320 acres, owned free and clear, Silas and Edith Brennan were beginning the next phase of a plan that had taken 34 years to execute. The mules, Jack and Jenny, who'd carried them through the hardest years, grazed in the pasture beyond the barn, their work finally finished. They'd earned retirement through decades of faithful service, pulling plows while tractors sat idle, proving that sometimes the old ways weren't backward, but simply waiting for the new ways to fail. Silas killed the tractor engines one by one. The silence after they stopped felt significant, like the pause between movements in a symphony. Tomorrow, he'd start learning to farm with machines instead of animals. Tomorrow, Dale Hostetler would arrive to begin teaching his former mocker how to use the equipment that had caused Dale's downfall. But today, in the quiet March morning, Silas Brennan stood beside his wife and allowed himself to feel something approaching satisfaction. Not triumph, not gloating, just the quiet recognition that patience had proven stronger than speed, that independence had survived crisis, and that the plan he'd formed watching trucks fail in Italian mountains had finally come to fruition on Missouri farmland. The future he'd prepared for had arrived, and he was ready. Dale Hostetler reported for work on Monday morning at 7, driving a 10-year-old pickup that burned oil and needed a new muffler. He parked beside Silas's ancient Chevrolet and understood immediately that his new employer wouldn't care about the truck's condition as long as it ran. The standards here were function over appearance, durability over shine. Silas met him at the barn door, already dressed for work despite the early hour. No handshake, no welcome speech. Just a gesture toward the three tractors lined up inside and an expectation that Dale would know what to do. Dale walked the length of each machine, examining maintenance that bordered on obsessive. The engines were spotless, the oil fresh, the hydraulics bled properly, every belt tight, every filter clean. These tractors had been maintained for 34 years by a man who understood that machinery deteriorated from neglect faster than from use. His voice came out impressed despite himself. "You could sell any of these for top dollar. They're in better shape than most new machines." Silas pulled on work gloves, ready to begin. "Not selling, using, need you to teach me what I don't know. The arrangement took shape over the following weeks. Dale knew modern farming techniques that Silas had deliberately avoided learning. Silas knew discipline and planning that Dale had never properly developed. Together they formed something neither could have achieved alone: competent management of 320 acres with equipment perfectly maintained but rarely operated. The learning curve was steep for both men. Silas had to unlearn 40 years of mule-based farming, adjusting to speeds and capabilities that felt almost dangerous after decades of patient animal rhythm. Dale had to adapt to working for someone else, taking direction instead of giving it, accepting wages instead of profits. But the arrangement functioned because both men needed it equally, and neither had the luxury of pride. Dale needed employment that came with dignity. Silas needed expertise he'd deliberately avoided acquiring. The exchange was clean and fair, and within 6 months they'd settled into routines that made the 320 acres productive in ways Silas's 120 had never been. The 1982 harvest proved the concept. 320 acres of soybeans and corn worked with machinery instead of animals yielded enough to pay all expenses and bank $23,000 in profit. Silas had never seen that much money from a single season. The numbers validated everything he'd planned while simultaneously revealing what he'd sacrificed by refusing to modernize earlier. But the sacrifice had been necessary. Without those decades of mule farming and aggressive saving, without the discipline to buy tractors and not use them, without the patience to wait while everyone else expanded on credit, he wouldn't own 320 acres debt-free while half the county faced foreclosure. In November 1982, another farm went to auction. The Hostetler Estate, Dale's uncle's property, 180 acres adjacent to the land Silas had purchased in 1980. The family couldn't maintain the operation after the uncle's death, and the heirs wanted cash rather than the burden of farming through a crisis that showed no signs of ending. Silas attended the auction with $35,000 in cash accumulated from the previous year's profits plus what remained from his original savings. The bidding was quieter than the 1980 sale, fewer spectators, less drama. People were getting used to farms changing hands, to land values that bore no relationship to historical norms, to futures being rewritten by forces beyond anyone's control. The 180 acres sold for $210 per acre. Silas won the bidding at that price, paying $37,800 and bringing his total holdings to 500 acres. The number felt significant, a threshold crossed. His father had farmed 120 acres for 45 years and considered it sufficient. Silas now owned more than 4 times that amount, all of it paid for in cash, none of it leveraged against future promises that might not be kept. He came home and found Edith in the garden pulling the last vegetables before frost arrived. She looked up when his truck pulled in, reading his expression before he spoke. She straightened, brushing soil from her hands. "You bought it," he nodded. 500 acres total, enough to keep me busy for whatever years I have left. She walked over and stood close enough to smell the auction house on his clothes, that particular combination of old paper and anxiety that characterized foreclosure sales. "Your father would be proud." The statement hit harder than expected. Cornelius Brennan had died 39 years earlier, long enough ago that Silas sometimes struggled to remember his voice clearly. But the lessons remained, vivid teachings that had shaped every major decision Silas made. Own what you need, control what you can, never depend on promises that others might break. His voice came out rough with emotion he usually suppressed. "Pop would have thought I was crazy for waiting so long. He believed in action." Edith shook her head. "Your father believed in preparation. You just prepared longer than he did." They stood together in the November afternoon, surrounded by land that represented the culmination of 4 decades of strategy. 500 acres owned free and clear, 3 tractors running perfectly, savings rebuilt to $15,000 despite the land purchases, a son educated and employed in the city, a marriage that had survived mockery and isolation, and the particular strain of trusting a plan that took half a lifetime to execute. The victory tasted like exhaustion mixed with relief, satisfaction layered over awareness that they'd sacrificed normal happiness for strategic success. But both of them were too old and too practical to second-guess decisions made decades earlier. This was the life they'd built. These were the results they'd earned. The community's perception shifted with remarkable speed once the evidence became undeniable. Silas Brennan wasn't lucky or eccentric. He was strategic in ways that most farmers either couldn't understand or couldn't stomach implementing. The mockery didn't transform into admiration. Rural Missouri was too conservative for such dramatic reversals, but it evolved into respect. Men who'd called him Mule Man now asked his opinion on equipment purchases and debt management. Women who'd pitied Edith now sought her company at church functions, recognizing that the strength required to stand beside Silas through 40 years of ridicule was worth acknowledging. The social rehabilitation happened gradually, almost invisibly, but Edith felt it in the way conversation shifted when she entered rooms. By 1985, Silas had become the informal financial advisor to younger farmers, trying to survive what agricultural economists were calling the farm crisis. Interest rates had spiked in the early 1980s, grain prices had collapsed, and farmers who'd expanded on credit during the boom years now faced impossible mathematics: land worth less than the loans against it, operating costs exceeding revenues, banks foreclosing on operations that had survived generations. Silas offered no formal consulting. He simply answered questions when asked, providing perspective shaped by experience that most farmers lacked. His advice was consistent. Reduce debt control costs, own your inputs, never depend on factors you can't influence. The recommendation sounded obvious when spoken aloud, but implementing them required discipline that felt impossible to men raised in the expansion era. One afternoon in June 1986, a young farmer named Michael stopped by seeking advice about a foreclosure notice he'd received. 28 years old, inherited 240 acres from his father, borrowed against it to buy equipment, now facing the loss of everything because crop prices had fallen below his cost of production. They sat at Silas's kitchen table while Edith served coffee. Neither of them touched. Michael spread papers across the surface loan documents and bank notices and the accumulated evidence of financial disaster. His voice shook slightly. I did everything right. Bought good land, invested in equipment.
Worked hard, and I'm going to lose it all because bean prices dropped 40 cents per bushel. Silas studied the papers without speaking for several minutes. The numbers told a familiar story. Too much debt, too little equity, too many factors beyond the farmer's control. Michael had made the same mistakes that Dale Hostetler made, that half of Barton County made, believing that the future would resemble the past and that agricultural economics would remain stable enough to justify leverage. Finally, Silas pushed the papers back across the table. You can't save this. The numbers don't work. Bank's right to foreclose. Michael's face went pale. That's it. Just give up. Silas met his eyes directly. Giving up would be declaring bankruptcy and walking away. I'm suggesting you sell before the bank forces the issue. Sell the land, sell the equipment, pay your debts and start over, without the weight of failure crushing you. The advice sounded harsh, almost cruel, but it came from someone who'd watched dozens of farmers fight losing battles until banks seized everything and left them with nothing but trauma and bad credit. Michael's voice came out bitter. Start over with what I'll have nothing. Silas's response was quiet but firm. You'll have freedom from debt. That's more than you have now. Michael left without thanking him, angry at advice that confirmed his worst fears. But 3 months later he followed it. Sold the land and equipment, paid the bank, and took a job at the John Deere plant in Ottumwa. 5 years after that, he saved enough to buy 40 acres cash and started farming part-time while keeping the factory job. The 40 acres stayed 40 acres, but it stayed his. Edith watched these interactions with growing understanding of what Silas had been trying to protect them from all along. The crisis wasn't just about oil prices or interest rates or commodity markets. It was about the fundamental vulnerability of depending on systems you couldn't control, building lives on promises that might not be kept, trusting that the future would cooperate with your plans. Silas had simply refused to make those assumptions, and his refusal, which looked like cowardice for 40 years now, looked like the only sane response to an insane system. Caleb visited for Christmas 1987, bringing with him a woman named Lorelei, who taught biology at a Kansas City high school. She was 32. Never married, intelligent in ways that made conversation challenging and rewarding simultaneously. Edith liked her, immediately recognizing a kindred spirit who'd chosen independence over conventional expectations. The visit lasted 3 days, and Caleb spent most of it walking the property with Silas, seeing for the first time what his father had built through decades of patience. 500 acres of paid-for ground, equipment that functioned perfectly, buildings maintained to standards that suggested permanence rather than temporary shelter. On the second day, standing in the barn, watching Silas perform routine maintenance on the Farmall 560, Caleb finally voiced what he'd been thinking since arriving. His tone carried something that might have been apology. I was ashamed of you growing up. Silas didn't look up from the oil he was draining. I know. Caleb continued, needing to explain. Every kid in school had fathers who drove new trucks and used modern equipment. And I had you plowing with mules while 3 tractors sat in this barn under tarps. I thought you were stuck in the past. Thought you were scared of change. Silas finished draining the oil and straightened, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen decades of similar service. You weren't wrong to feel that way. From your perspective, it looked like fear. Caleb shook his head. But it wasn't fear. It was strategy. You were preparing for something everyone else thought was impossible. Silas crossed to where his son stood and looked at him directly. Seeing in Caleb's face echoes of his own features mixed with Edith's intelligence, strategy and fear aren't opposites. I was scared. Scared of debt. Scared of dependence. Scared of building a life that required everything to go right. The strategy was just how I managed the fear. The admission surprised Caleb. He'd always seen his father as someone beyond normal emotion, too disciplined for fear or doubt or any of the vulnerabilities that plagued regular people. Understanding that Silas had been scared all along somehow made the 40 years of mule farming more impressive, rather than less. Caleb's voice softened. Mom stood by you through all of it. The mockery, the isolation, everything. Silas nodded. Your mother is the strongest person I've ever known. Stronger than me by a measure I can't calculate. They finished the maintenance in comfortable silence, and that evening at dinner, Caleb announced that he and Lorelei were engaged. The wedding would be in June. Small ceremony. Both families. Nothing elaborate. Edith cried the happy tears of a mother who'd worried her son would never settle, would drift through life without anchor or commitment. Silas shook Caleb's hand and welcomed Lorelei to the family with genuine warmth that he rarely displayed. After Caleb and Lorelei went to bed, Silas and Edith sat in the kitchen finishing the day the way they'd finished thousands of days before, quiet conversation. Comfortable silence, the particular intimacy of people who'd weathered storms together. Edith's voice came soft through the darkness. "I never thought I'd see him bring someone home." Silas reached across the table for her hand. "He's happy. That's what matters." She squeezed his fingers. "We did something right. Somehow, despite everything, we raised a good man." The assessment felt accurate. Caleb had escaped the farm without escaping his parents' values. He worked hard, saved aggressively, avoided debt, made decisions based on long-term consequences rather than short-term gratification. The lessons had taken root, even if the specific application differed from what Silas and Edith had modeled. Outside, winter wind moved across 500 acres of ground that would rest until spring planting. The tractor sat in the barn ready for another season. Jack had died in 1984, Jenny in 1986, both buried in the far pasture where they'd grazed during retirement. Their contribution to the Brennan family fortune was incalculable, and Silas visited their graves occasionally, acknowledging debts that couldn't be repaid. The years accumulated. 1988, 1989, 1990. Silas turned 75 in 1990, still farming 500 acres with Dale's help, still maintaining equipment with the same obsessive care he'd shown for 5 decades. His body was slowing, but functional muscles built from manual labor lasting longer than office worker physiques ever could. Edith aged beside him, her 70th birthday arriving in 1987 with less celebration than acknowledgement. The headaches that had plagued her through middle age returned occasionally, but she managed them with aspirin and rest and stubborn refusal to let physical discomfort dictate her schedule. Dale Hostetler stayed on, now 62 himself, working for wages he could have earned elsewhere, but choosing to remain on land he'd once owned. The arrangement benefited both men equally. Silas needed help. He couldn't afford to hire at market rates, and Dale needed employment that came without the burden of decision-making authority. They worked together with minimal conversation, understanding each other through decades of shared experience. Dale taught Silas the nuances of modern equipment operation. Silas taught Dale the value of patience over speed. The exchange was fair and productive, and neither man wasted time acknowledging the strange trajectory that had brought them to this relationship. Caleb and Lorelei married in June 1988 and settled in Kansas City, where both maintained teaching careers and built a life that looked nothing like Silas and Edith's, but honored similar values. They visited quarterly calls, became weekly, and when Lorelei announced her pregnancy in 1992, Edith cried for the second time in 5 years. The first grandchild arrived in April 1993, a daughter named Claire. The second followed in October 1995, a son named Matthew. Silas held them both with the careful attention of someone handling valuable machinery, aware of fragility, but confident in his ability to avoid breaking what he touched. Edith transformed in ways that surprised everyone, becoming demonstrative and openly affectionate in ways she'd never been with her own child. She traveled to Kansas City monthly, staying for weeks at a time, helping Lorelei manage the particular exhaustion of early motherhood. The grandmother she became bore little resemblance to the reserved woman who'd weathered 40 years of social isolation on a Missouri farm. Silas watched this transformation with quiet pleasure, understanding that Edith was finally experiencing the normal family relationships that farm life had denied her. The grandchildren adored her, and she returned the affection without reservation or the careful control that had characterized her earlier parenting. December 1994 arrived cold and bitter, temperatures dropping below zero for the first time in 7 years. Edith was in Kansas City helping with the children, while Lorelei recovered from a difficult case of flu. Silas stayed home managing winter chores alone, feeding livestock and breaking ice in water tanks, and performing the endless maintenance that farming required regardless of season. The call came on December 18th, Caleb's voice tight with controlled panic. "Dad, Mom had a stroke. We're at Research Medical Center. You need to come." Silas drove 4 hours through ice and darkness, the ancient Chevrolet truck, performing one final service by delivering him safely, despite conditions that closed highways across Missouri. He arrived at the hospital at 3 in the morning and found Caleb in the waiting room, face aged by stress into something that resembled middle age despite his 47 years. Caleb stood when Silas entered. "She's stable. They got her here fast. The doctors think she'll recover most function, but it'll take time." Silas nodded, processing information through the particular fog that exhaustion and fear created. "Can I see her?" They walked together through antiseptic corridors to a room where Edith lay connected to machines that monitored functions her body should have managed automatically. She was awake awareness present in eyes that tracked his movement despite her inability to speak clearly. He sat beside the bed and took her hand, feeling the weakness in fingers that had worked gardens and cooked meals and held his own hands through 48 years of marriage. The stroke had stolen her voice temporarily, but her eyes communicated everything necessary. Fear mixed with determination, vulnerability, layered over strength that wouldn't surrender to medical crisis. His voice came out steadier than he felt. "You're going to be fine, Edie. Doctors say you'll recover. Just needs time." She squeezed his hand, weakly, acknowledgement without agreement. Both of them understanding that recovery at 77 was different than recovery at 40. Bodies didn't bounce back from strokes. They adapted, compromised, learned to function with diminished capacity. She stayed hospitalized for 3 weeks, relearning speech and movement through therapies that frustrated her with their slow progress.
Silas visited daily, driving the 4 hours each direction, sleeping in the truck when he was too tired to drive home, existing in the liminal space of hospital waiting rooms and rehabilitation centers. Caleb took family leave from his job to coordinate caremaking decisions about treatments and therapies while consulting Silas on everything major. The role reversal was complete, the son managing the parents' crisis, the father accepting help he'd never needed before. Edith came home in early January 1995, mobile but changed. Her speech returned, mostly slight slurring on certain words, betraying the damage that therapy couldn't fully repair. Her right side remained weaker than her left, requiring a cane for balance she'd never needed before. But she was alive and functional, and determined to recover as much independence as possible. Silas became her primary caregiver, a role he approached with the same systematic thoroughness he'd applied to farming. He learned medications and therapy exercises and the particular patience required to help someone relearn basic functions. Dale took over more farm responsibilities, understanding without being told that Silas's priorities had shifted. Through the winter and into spring, Edith improved incrementally. The weakness in her right side lessened, but never disappeared completely. The speech difficulties faded to barely noticeable hesitations on complex words.
She could walk without the cane indoors, but needed it for longer distances. They adapted to the new reality, adjusting routines to accommodate limitations that wouldn't improve further. Silas moved their bedroom to the ground floor to eliminate stairs. He installed grab bars in the bathroom and reorganized the kitchen to put frequently used items within easy reach. The adjustments came naturally, neither of them discussing the implications of needing them.
They were 79 and 77, and bodies that had worked for 8 decades were entitled to require accommodation. In June 1995, sitting on the porch watching sunset color the western sky, Edith spoke with clarity that had been absent since the stroke. Her voice carried weight beyond the words. "Sigh. I need to say something while I can still say it clearly." He set down the account book he'd been reviewing and gave her complete attention.
She continued, each word measured. "You saved for us, not for yourself. Every dollar, every sacrifice, every year of mockery you endured, it was all to protect me and Caleb." He started to protest, but she raised her hand to stop him. Her eyes met his directly. "I never thanked you properly. For the 30 years you were right while I was scared. For standing firm when I wanted you to give in. For seeing something I couldn't see and trusting it anyway." His voice came rough. "Edie, you thanked me every day by staying, by trusting when trust was all I could ask." She smiled, the expression carrying 48 years of shared experience. "I never regretted marrying you. Not once. Even when it was hardest." He reached for her hand, holding it with the gentle firmness of someone who understood how precious and fragile connection could be. "Best decision I ever made was walking you home from that church social. Everything good in my life came from that one choice." They sat together, watching darkness replace light, comfortable in silence that required no words to convey meaning. The farm stretched around them, 500 acres, representing 48 years of strategy, executed with patience that most people couldn't sustain for 48 days. 2 months later, on August 12, 1995, Edith died in her sleep. No warning, no final crisis. She simply didn't wake up. The doctor attributed it to a second stroke smaller than the first, but positioned in a location that made survival impossible. Silas found her at dawn when he brought her morning coffee, a ritual they'd maintained for 49 years. She looked peaceful, expression suggesting dreams rather than death. And for several minutes he simply stood holding the coffee cup, unable to process that the person who'd shared his entire adult life was gone. The funeral filled Lamar First Baptist Church beyond capacity. 400 people attending to honor a woman most of them had barely known, but all of them respected. Edith Brennan had stood beside her husband through 40 years of mockery, and her loyalty deserved acknowledgement even if her life had been too private for widespread friendship. Harlan Voss gave the eulogy, an unexpected choice that Caleb arranged after Silas proved too grief-stricken to speak. Harlan was 75 himself, retired from the dealership, diminished by age, but still commanding presence when he chose. His voice carried across the packed church. "Edith Brennan was the strongest woman I ever knew. She stood by her husband for 48 years while men like me mocked him. She never wavered. She never complained publicly. She trusted when trust seemed foolish." He paused, looking directly at Silas in the front pew. Silas Brennan was the smartest farmer in this county, but Edith was the backbone that kept him standing. She was the courage behind his strategy. "I'm sorry I never told you that while you were alive, Mrs. Brennan." The service continued with hymns and prayers and the formal rituals that marked passage from life to death. They buried her in the cemetery behind the farmhouse next to Cornelius Brennan, and not far from where Jack and Jenny rested in unmarked graves. Silas stood at the graveside after everyone else had left alone with loss that felt impossible to survive. Edith had been his anchor, his conscience, his reason for building something beyond himself. Without her, the 500 acres felt meaningless, the saved money pointless, the entire strategy hollow. Caleb found him there 2 hours later, still standing, staring at fresh earth that covered the person who'd made his life worthwhile. Caleb's voice came gentle. "Dad, we should go inside." Silas didn't move. "She was supposed to outlive me. I'm 3 years older. She was supposed to have the farm and the money and the satisfaction of seeing it all work out." Caleb stood beside his father, both of them looking at the grave. She did see it work out. She saw you buy 500 acres. She saw you vindicated. She met her grandchildren. She died knowing you were right about everything.
Silas's voice broke on the words, but she didn't get to enjoy it. We spent 48 years preparing, and she died before we could just live. Caleb had no answer that would ease that particular pain. His mother had indeed spent her entire married life waiting for a future that arrived only to take her before she could experience it. The tragedy was real and irreversible, and exactly the kind of cruel timing that made faith difficult to maintain. They walked back to the farmhouse together, leaving Edith in the ground she'd tended for nearly 5 decades, surrounded by land she'd helped protect through sheer force of loyalty. Silas aged rapidly after Edith died. The vitality that had kept him working into his 80s diminished visibly, strength bleeding away with each passing month. He continued farming with Dale's help through the 1995 harvest, but the effort cost him more than it should have. In January 1996, he called Caleb and asked him to come to the farm for a conversation that couldn't happen over the phone. Caleb drove down on a Saturday, bringing Lorelei and the children, all of them understanding that Silas was preparing for endings he'd avoided confronting while Edith lived. They gathered in the kitchen after dinner, children playing in the living room, while adults discussed matters that required privacy. Silas retrieved a metal box from the bedroom closet and set it on the table with deliberate care. His voice carried formality unusual even for him. "Need to show you something. Should have done this years ago, but your mother said to wait until the right time. Figure this is it." He opened the box and removed documents that Caleb had never seen before: stock certificates, bonds, account statements from investment firms in St. Louis and Kansas City. The papers looked official and important and completely inconsistent with Silas's lifetime aversion to complexity. Caleb picked up the first certificate, reading details that didn't make sense. "You own stock in Exxon." Silas nodded. "Bought it in 1974. Also Chevron Phillips 66. Bought when oil prices crashed after the first embargo ended. Everyone thought petroleum companies were finished. They were selling at 20 cents on the dollar." Caleb spread the certificates across the table, counting companies and shares, doing rough calculations that produced numbers too large to make sense. "How much did you invest?" Silas consulted a handwritten ledger that documented every purchase: $18,000 between 1974 and 1980. Bought when everyone was panicking. Caleb looked at the current statement's numbers that represented 22 years of appreciation and dividend reinvestment. "Dad, these are worth $285,000. Silas nodded calmly. Market's been good to patient investors. Lorelei, who'd been quiet until now, spoke up. "What about these bonds?" Silas pulled out Treasury bond documentation. "Bought those between 1981 and 1990. $40,000 invested. Currently worth about $78,000. Caleb was doing math, frantically adding totals that kept climbing. "And you have how much in regular savings?" Silas consulted the bank statement. "About $52,000 at Lamar Farmers Bank." The silence that followed was broken only by children's laughter from the next room, oblivious to the revelation happening at the kitchen table. Finally, Caleb found his voice. "You're telling me you have $415,000 in liquid assets, plus 500 acres worth roughly $1,350 per acre," Silas confirmed with a single nod. "Give or take. Land values fluctuate." Caleb did the final calculation. "You're worth over $1 million. The number hung in the air, ridiculous and accurate simultaneously. Silas Brennan, who'd driven the same truck for 40 years, who'd worn patched clothes to save money, who'd endured decades of mockery for farming with mules, that man was a millionaire. Caleb's voice came out strangled. "Why didn't you spend any of this? You and Mom could have retired to Florida, traveled, enjoyed life." Silas looked at his son directly. "We had everything we needed, this land, each other, you. The money was never the point." Caleb shook his head, struggling to comprehend. "Then what was the point?" Silas's answer came simple and devastating. "Freedom. No bank owned us. No crisis could break us. We built something that couldn't be taken away by oil prices or interest rates or any other force we couldn't control. That was the victory." He paused, looking at documents that represented half a century of disciplined saving. "Your mother made me promise to enjoy the money. But money doesn't buy what we already had. It just buys insurance against losing it." Lorelei wiped tears that had started falling without her noticing. "She stood by you through everything, never knowing how much you'd accumulated." Silas shook his head. "She knew. Found the bank book in 1959, saw the stocks in 1975 when I filed taxes. She knew. Just trusted me to manage it responsibly." He pushed the documents toward Caleb. "This is yours when I'm gone. The land, the money, all of it. But I need you to understand what it cost to build. Your mother gave up normal life, gave up respect and comfort and everything she deserved. She did it because she trusted me, and her trust was worth more than every dollar in that box." Caleb nodded, unable to speak, understanding finally the full weight of what his parents had sacrificed. Not just comfort, but normalcy itself, trading social acceptance for strategic security, choosing isolation over integration because independence mattered more than fitting in. They spent the rest of the evening reviewing documents, Silas explaining investment decisions and rationales with the same systematic thoroughness he applied to farming. Every purchase had been calculated, every decision based on long-term value rather than short-term profit. The portfolio reflected a lifetime of patience applied to financial markets the same way he'd applied it to agriculture. When Caleb and his family left on Sunday afternoon, Silas stood on the porch watching their car disappear toward the interstate. He'd done what needed doing. Transferred knowledge that would matter after he was gone, ensured that his son understood both the strategy and its cost. He walked to the cemetery and stood at Edith's grave, speaking to earth that covered the woman who'd made everything worthwhile. His voice came quiet. Told him today? About the stocks and bonds, the full picture. He understands now what you gave up for me. The wind moved through bare trees, February cold settling across Missouri farmland. Silas continued. I miss you. Every morning I wake up expecting to find you there. Every evening I want to tell you about the day.
Nothing works right without you. He stayed until darkness forced him back to the farmhouse, back to rooms that echoed with absence, back to a life that had lost its purpose when Edith died. Silas Brennan lasted another 2.5 years, his body declining steadily despite the physical strength built through 8 decades of manual labor. Dale Hostetler managed the farm increasingly independently, making decisions that Silas no longer had energy to consider. In June 1998, Silas drafted his will with a lawyer from Lamar, ensuring that his wishes would be executed precisely. The document was detailed and specific, leaving nothing to interpretation or chance. 500 acres plus $250,000 in liquid assets went to Caleb Brennan. $100,000 to Lorelei Brennan for grandchildren's education. $50,000 to Dale Hostetler for years of faithful service. $30,000 to Barton County 4-H for teaching patience and animal husbandry. The 3 tractors were to be restored and donated to the Smithsonian American History Museum. Stock portfolio divided between Caleb and grandchildren. Every provision reflected priorities that had shaped Silas's entire life. Family first, employees. Second, community third. Everything documented. Nothing left uncertain. He died on July 15, 1998 at age 83, sitting on the porch watching sunset, color 500 acres of ground he'd protected through discipline that most people couldn't sustain for 83 days. Dale found him an hour later peaceful in the chair where he'd sat countless evenings with Edith gone without struggle or apparent pain. The funeral drew 600 people, the entire county coming to acknowledge a man they'd finally learned to respect. Caleb gave the eulogy voice steady, despite grief that threatened to break through his control. He stood at the front of Lamar First Baptist Church, looking out at faces that ranged from elderly farmers who'd witnessed Silas's entire strategy to young people who knew only the legend. My father taught me patience, not by preaching, but by living it. For 40 years he was mocked. For 40 years my mother stood by him. They didn't need the world's approval. They had each other's. He paused, gathering himself. That's the legacy I want to pass to my children. Not the money he saved or the land he bought, the example of 2 people who trusted each other enough to wait 40 years for vindication that most people thought would never come. They buried Silas next to Edith in the cemetery behind the farmhouse. Cornelius Brennan rested nearby, 3 generations of farmers and ground they'd worked and protected and ultimately been returned to. The will was read the following week, and Dale Hostetler broke down completely when he learned about his bequest. $50,000. More money than he'd saved in his entire life, given by the man he'd mocked for 20 years, before circumstances forced him to understand what Silas had known all along. Dale found Caleb after the reading. I called your father Mule Man for 2 decades, made jokes, laughed at his expense, and he gave me a job when I lost everything. Now this. Caleb recognized the same gratitude mixed with shame that he'd felt himself. He didn't hold grudges. The past was past. He just moved forward. Dale nodded, tears streaming freely. Your father was the best man I ever knew. I'll make sure everyone remembers that. And he did. For the next 12 years until his own death in 2010, Dale Hostetler told Silas Brennan's story to anyone who'd listen. Young farmers struggling with debt, students studying agricultural history, journalists writing about the farm crisis. Dale gave them all the same message: patience wins, debt kills, freedom matters more than size. Caleb Brennan stood in his father's barn in February 2010, 63 years old, still farming the 500 acres he'd inherited 12 years earlier. He used modern John Deere equipment, efficient and computerized, but he kept the 1964 Farmall 560 running for nostalgia and the lessons it represented. His daughter Claire, now 16, stood beside him, examining the old tractor with teenage skepticism. Grandpa kept this for 40 years before using it. Caleb ran his hand along the faded red hood. Bought it in 1964, parked it under a tarp, didn't use it until 1980, maintained it perfectly the entire time. Claire shook her head. That's crazy. Caleb smiled. That's strategy. Your grandfather knew something everyone else didn't. Matthew, his 13-year-old son, joined them in the barn. What did he know? Caleb considered the question, thinking about lessons that had taken him 40 years to fully understand. He knew that size doesn't matter if you don't own it, that debt is slavery disguised as opportunity, that patience beats speed every time. He looked at his children, seeing in them the next generation that would either carry forward or abandon the values Silas and Edith had died protecting. Your great-grandfather came home from World War II having watched supply lines fail. He saw men die because they depended on things that didn't arrive. So he built a life based on controlling what he could control and not depending on promises others might break. Claire was listening now. skepticism replaced by genuine interest. And everyone thought he was crazy. Caleb nodded. For 40 years, they called him Mule Man, mocked him at church and the feed store and everywhere else. Your grandmother stood beside him through all of it, trusting when trust seemed foolish.
Matthew asked the question that mattered. Was he right? Caleb walked them to the cemetery behind the farmhouse to graves that held 3 generations of Brennans, plus 2 mules whose contribution couldn't be measured in money. He stood between his children, one hand on each shoulder. When everyone else lost their farms in the 1980s, Grandpa bought land cheap because he had no debt and money saved. When oil prices tripled, his costs didn't change because he used mules. He was right about everything because he understood that the world runs on patterns that repeat if you're patient enough to wait for them. Claire looked at the graves, doing math that produced understanding. So all those years of being mocked, he was actually winning. Caleb corrected gently. He was preparing. The winning came later. But preparation requires believing in something others can't see. That's what made Grandpa special. And what made Grandma even more special was trusting him while seeing no evidence that he was right. They stood in silence for several minutes, wind moving across 500 acres that represented patience made physical. The land would continue long after all of them were gone, producing crops and supporting whoever owned it, indifferent to human drama, but shaped by human choices. Matthew's voice came quiet. What happened to the guy who lost his farm? The one Grandpa bought land from? Caleb smiled. Dale Hostetler worked for Grandpa for 18 years. Grandpa left him $50,000 in his will. Dale used it to help young farmers avoid the mistakes he made. He died 2 months ago, still telling Grandpa's story. Claire absorbed this. So Grandpa won by helping the person who lost. The observation was more sophisticated than Caleb expected from a 16-year-old, but it captured something essential about Silas Brennan's character. Grandpa won by being prepared when opportunity arrived. Then he shared the victory with people who needed help. That's the difference between being smart and being wise. They walked back to the barn where the Farmall 560 sat among modern equipment, a reminder of patience that most people couldn't sustain, and strategies that looked like madness until circumstances proved them brilliant. Caleb started the old tractor hearing and its rumble echoes of a man who understood that the hardest victories required the longest patience. The engine settled into steady rhythm, reliable despite age, functional, despite decades of sitting idle. He shut it off and looked at his children. Your great-grandparents spent their entire marriage preparing for catastrophes they couldn't predict and trusting each other when trust was all they had. They died before getting to enjoy what they built, but they left us something more valuable than money. Then Claire asked, what? Caleb's answer came from understanding earned through watching his father's strategy play out across 8 decades. They left us an example of what 2 people can accomplish if they trust each other enough to wait. That's worth more than 500 acres or $1 million. That's a legacy. The children nodded, too young to fully understand, but old enough to recognize that something important was being transmitted. They would carry forward what they could carry, adapt what needed adapting, and hopefully maintain some core of values that Silas and Edith had protected through mockery and isolation and the relentless discipline required to wait 40 years for vindication. Outside, February wind moved across Missouri farmland that had seen 4 generations of Brennans work its soil. The land endured because someone had valued ownership over size, patience over speed, freedom over fitting in. Somewhere beneath that ground, Jack and Jenny rested in unmarked graves, 2 mules who'd carried a family through the hardest years, proving that sometimes the old ways weren't backward, but simply waiting for the new ways to fail. Silas and Edith Brennan lay together in the cemetery, holding ground they'd defended through strategy that looked like cowardice, until circumstances revealed it as the only sane response to an insane system. The story was complete. The lessons were transferred. The farm remained. And in Barton County, Missouri, when farmers faced debt or crisis or decisions about how to build futures in uncertain times, they still told the story of Mule Man Silas, the man who waited 40 years to be proven right and died, knowing that patience was its own kind of courage, that loyalty was harder than love, and that freedom mattered more than everything else combined.